So in the previous video, we considered McX's argument that Pegasus exists and Quine's reply to that argument, which doesn't show that either of the premises is false, but rather shows that McX's explanation of how the way in which Pegasus exists is inconsistent with premise one. So the argument as a package, which thinking of it as including the motivation for 3, is inconsistent. It's inherently contradictory, self-contradictory. Wyman comes along and as the next interlocutor and says, look, I think Pegasus does exist. And the problem is with McX's explanation for how it is, the way in which Pegasus exists. I think instead, Pegasus exists not as an idea, but rather as an unactualized possible. So the idea here is there's a distinction between things that actually exist and things that exist, where things that actually exist are a proper subset of things that exist. That is, there are more things that exist than there are things that actually exist. So the idea is there's the actual world, things that actually exist at the actual world, and then there's other possible worlds, and some things that don't exist at the actual world exist at those other possible worlds, and they're called unactualized possibles. Now, you can talk in terms of possible worlds, but you don't have to. You can talk in terms of possibilia, thinking of them not as worlds, but as like possible individuals and possible properties and so on and so forth. Whatever you want is fine. I'm going to talk about unactualized possibles as individuals and properties and so on that exist at some possible world, but not at our possible world. So Wyman says, actuality is a property that Pegasus lacks, but he nonetheless exists. Your mistake, Quine, was thinking that only actual things exist. We now have an argument to the contrary. And the argument goes like this. S1 is meaningful. If S1 is meaningful, then Pegasus exists. Therefore, Pegasus exists. And we just continue right along and say Pegasus doesn't actually exist. As Quine correctly points out, Pegasus isn't flying around here somewhere. Therefore, mere possibilities, possibilia, exist. Okay, Quine says, like, look, I don't like this. Slow down. First of all, the idea that mere possibilities exist offends my taste for desert landscapes. And you might think he's making an aesthetic claim here, but really what he's saying is that something like a principle of ontological parsimony should play a role in theory choice. And a principle of ontological parsimony will say, don't posit things. There's different ways you can cash out the principle, but a rough first pass principle says, don't say that something exists unless it does explanatory work for you. And more specifically, don't say that something exists unless it does explanatory work for you that can't be done in a simpler way. And Quine's idea here is that you can explain the meaningfulness of S1 without appealing to Pegasus, so you can have a more parsimonious theory that avoids appeal to Pegasus. After all, says Quine, this is now sort of pushing the desert landscapes, appeal to parsimony kind of thing. If mere possibilities exist, then so much exists. And should we really countenance so much? More importantly, he says, the claim that mere possibilities exist leads to contradictions, leads into nonsense. And then he gives an example. He says, compare the possible fat man in the doorway to the possible bald man in the doorway. Here's a question about those two possible men. Are they the same man or are they distinct men? And what Quine's going to go on to say is, you, friend of possibilia, you, the advocate of these mere possible worlds existing, is not going to have any way to say whether the fat man and the mere possible fat man in the doorway and the possible bald man in the doorway are in fact the same man or distinct men. And if you have no way to make such basic distinctions as between two things being identical and two things being distinct, then you don't know what you're talking about. So he says positing possibilia leads to undesirable consequences, so we shouldn't posit them. And then he continues, even if there were no immediate problems with positing possibilia, positing them wouldn't help. And now what he's going to do is he's going to go on to show the following. He's going to show that positing possibilia can't really explain what needs to be explained, everything that needs to be explained. So let's see why that is. He asks us to consider the round square cupola on Berkeley College campus. So here's a cupola, and we're supposed to consider one that's round and square. Obviously, I can't draw a picture of a round square cupola because it's not possible. So let's recall why somebody might think that premise 2 is true. If Pegasus doesn't exist, then talk of Pegasus is talk of nothing, which is nonsense, which is meaningful, which suggests a general principle. That is, the argument right here for premise 2 suggests a general principle. And we can call this the meaning entity principle, or the meaningfulness entity principle. And what it says is, if talk of an entity is meaningful, so for example, if talk of Pegasus is meaningful, then that entity, for example, Pegasus, must exist. Given this general principle, one can argue as follows. Pegasus was birthed from Medusa's head is meaningful. If it's meaningful, then Pegasus exists. That's our principle right here. Therefore, Pegasus exists. But Pegasus doesn't actually exist. Therefore, mere possibilities exist. So Quine thinks that something like this principle is playing the key role of explaining why we should accept 2. But now Quine is going to say this. The sentence, the round square cupola on Berkeley Square is beautiful, is meaningful. That sentence is meaningful. Well, by our meaningfulness entity principle, it follows that the round square cupola exists. So the round square cupola, we know that it doesn't actually exist, and we know that it doesn't possibly exist because round squares are impossible. Therefore, just as over here on the left, we conclude that mere possibilities exist from the premise that Pegasus exists and the premise that Pegasus doesn't actually exist. Over here, we conclude that mere impossibilities exist from the premise that the round square cupola exists and the premise that the round square cupola neither actually nor possibly exists. Now, why is this a problem? Well, it's a problem because 5 is clearly false. It's just not true that impossibilities exist. And if it's not true that impossibilities exist, then we have to say, look, show me where this argument goes wrong. Well, the argument is structurally the same as this argument. So if this one over here has bad logic, this one over here does too, and we can't conclude that mere possibilities exist. So Wyman can't say the structure of this one is bad. So it has to be one of the premises that go bad. Since each argument has the same logic, Wyman can't say that one is valid and the other isn't. Now, where else could it be going wrong? Well, clearly, Wyman's not going to reject 4 star, the round square cupola neither actually nor possibly exists. That would be to embrace the existence of round squares, which presumably Wyman's not going to do. That leaves us with rejecting 1 or rejecting 2. Well, since the M then E principle, meaningfulness then entity exists principle, supports 2 star no less than it supports 2, Wyman can't say that 2 is true but 2 star is false. The idea being the very reason for accepting 2 is this principle. Well, this principle equally supports 2 star, so Wyman can't reject 2 star. So that leaves Wyman with 2 options. We already talked about 4 star, so really you have to reject 1 star. Well, Quine insists that S5 is meaningful, and so you can't reject 1 star. Why I think S5 is meaningful? Well, one might be tempted to reject this claim on the ground that contradictions are meaningless, and therefore predicates that express a property which is contradictory are themselves meaningless. Quine replies as follows. He says, we must take contradictions to be meaningful in order to preserve the reductio ad absurdum argument form, and in order to be able to determine whether any symbol string makes sense. Now, we're not going to talk about the second reason. This comes from an argument from Tarski. Tarski claims that if strings of symbols like P and not P are meaningless, then we can't actually basically make sense of any symbol string. That is, we can't say any symbol string has meaning. Let's just take that as a result that's granted, then Quine gets his point. What about reductio ad absurdum? Well, reductio ad absurdum is the argument form where you have, in addition to your premises, an assumption. And the assumption is a claim you're kind of trying to test. And what you're doing is you're saying, let's assume this claim is true, throw it in with our premises and see what happens. If you get to a contradiction, since you know your premises are true, they being premises, it must be the assumption that led you astray, led you into the contradiction, so then you go back and reject the assumption. This is a common argument form. It's a widely accepted argument form. But if the line on your proof that says, that expresses the contradiction, the line that says, for example, P and not P is meaningless, then you ought not be able to infer the negation of the assumption. So reductio ad absurdum becomes a bad form of argument if contradictions are meaningless. So, says Quine, we ought to preserve the meaningfulness of symbol strings as per Tarski, and we ought to preserve reductio ad absurdum, so we can't reject 1 star. Now, why I think 4 star is true, you might be tempted to reject it on the ground that square cupola possibly exists. Well, Quine just says, look, round squares are paradigmatically impossible objects. If you want to say that round squares exist, are possible, you're just going to end up saying of everything that it's possible. There's going to be nothing you're going to say is impossible, and then the distinction between possibility and impossibility becomes nonsense. Recall that yellow argument must be unsound because 5 is false. You can't have a false conclusion in a sound argument. Well, Quine thinks that 1 star and 4 star are clearly true. He thinks the logic is good. More importantly, he thinks that no advocate of red argument could reasonably reject 1, 4, or the logic. And that leaves us only with 2. So Quine thinks since 5 is false, 1 and 4, your premises are true, and your inferences are all good, it must be that premise 2 is false. That is, 2 star is false. Well, if 2 star is false, it's going to mean that M then E is false, because 2 star follows from M then E. But if M then E is false, then M then E is false here too, so 2 here is false. Put it another way, if we reject M then E, then we have no reason to accept 2, so we should reject 2. Now, of course, really this doesn't show that 2 is false. What it shows is it's unmotivated. That is, we haven't provided any reason to believe it. But Quine thinks, look, you have no reason to believe it. There's already, strong reason to reject it. Look at the consequence it leads to. It leads us to say that mere possibilities exist. So let's reject it. Wyman has no way to respond, since any way to respond would equally would lead to endorsing yellow argument, which of course you can't do because that leads to the impossible, absurd conclusion that mere impossibilities exist. So coming back to the argument, Quine says, so if this argument leads one to admit Pegasus into her ontology, it also leads her to admit impossibilia into her ontology. As we've just seen, impossibilia shouldn't be admitted into your ontology, so one shouldn't admit Pegasus. And Wyman at this point says, look, that's all very clever, but we haven't gotten very far. Clearly S1 is meaningful. I can make sense of S1 via possibilia. You haven't shown me how to make sense of S1 in any other way. So it seems like we're stuck with possibilia. So, says Wyman, I'm not persuaded. And Quine at this point says, fair enough. Let me now show you how to make S1 make sense without accepting that Pegasus exists. And we'll stop here and continue with that next time.